this, and Lesser loaned the manuscript to him so it could be, portions of it could be reprinted in Killer. But that book comes out in 1970. But it wasn't really until Tom Gitchoff, and I assume he heard of the book and had read it. But he brings Henry Lesser to his criminal justice class in 1979. And at that time, Killer's Guard, an interview with Henry Lesser, is filmed by SDSU. And the following year, Lesser comes again to San Diego State. It's at that time when he donates the manuscript. So, yeah, there's no way really to gain access to this material and have people use it, which is why we have it. If people like John Borowski don't do the things that they did, and his work, I think, was much more influential as far as people being able to make some sense out of this manuscript than Gaddis and Long's book.
Yeah, very true. And let me ask you this also. So I asked you if prior to that had anyone come and wanted to look at the manuscripts. How about after? Did it pique anyone's interest that John did it, and they're like, maybe I need to take a look at this now? Is there anything that's happened after John did that?
Oh, sure. Folks have come in to see the manuscript quite often. Now, the fact that it is online, the original manuscript has been digitized and is available online, means that, and we can do, we can analyze the traffic on our website, and we see that page is heavily used. Now, one thing, when people come in here to use the original, we don't let them use the original. They can only use Xerox copies of the original, because the original's, it's written on this prison stationery, and the handling of it would ruin it. So that's one reason why we scanned it and made it available, to save the information, because it won't be too long before the manuscript, the original, crumbles. It's highly acidic paper. If you look at it online, you can see just how brittle and how burned out, excuse me, that it's becoming. John's film has garnered much greater interest in the autobiography and in related materials than it ever did before the documentary.
Okay, well, here's something that I find interesting, because you kept talking about, what archivists do. But, I'm curious, can you kind of walk through what you guys actually do as far as trying to preserve these? And don't feel like you need to lack details or anything like that. I don't mind listening to it, and I don't think everybody else would mind either, because I got to assume that most people don't know all of the work that goes into it.
Well, it's a preservation and access mission. So we determine those things we feel need to be saved, need to be passed on to next generations and beyond. Our job is to apply archival techniques to the storage of paper, but now that everything is in many cases born digital, or like we're doing with this manuscript, scanning it, and it's now in digitized form, the preservation of the digital file is a real challenge. And so that's kind of the frontier. How do we preserve digitized materials and deal with format obsolescence and bit rot of scanned files? Every time you access a digital file, you're ripping off some data potentially, and how do you migrate these formats now into the next generation? How do you deal with obsolescence in the technology and in the playback. So we deal with paper. Actually, the challenge of preserving paper after the Civil War is much greater than paper prior to that, because paper prior to that had such rag content in it that we have, for example, newspapers from the 18th century, early American newspapers that are in far better condition than 20th century newspapers, which are you can't turn the page without the paper crumbling. Paper was mass-produced, and in order to create mass-produced paper, you had to throw a lot of chemicals into it, and it's those chemicals that are slowly burning the paper up. If you walk into a newspaper repository, that characteristic smell that you'll notice, you can't avoid it, is the paper burning up. It's oxidizing, and fire is a process of oxidation. It's a slow fire, and there's no flame, but nevertheless it's burning up as we speak. So we have the challenge with paper, and so when we process materials, we're concerned about anything that will detract from the preservation of the item. So all paper goes into acid-free folders that are held in acid-free containers. Metal that rusts is removed, and all sorts of other conservation and preservation techniques that archivists do. And then, so that the collection is usable, we have to arrange it and describe it in a way that makes it usable. So I'm not at all an expert on the Panzram papers, but what I've tried to do is be expert in saving it so that it'll be available for people that are experts and in the content, and we describe the materials as best we can so that users will be able to decide, do they want to spend time going into a folder or into a container, or does it not pertain to what they're interested in? So archives is preservation and access is providing descriptions of materials that let the user know what they're going to be digging into.
Well, one other thing about that, I wanted to ask, and again, I'm just saying personal opinion. Do you think that you guys are housing anything else that you feel like the general public would be really interested in? Just, maybe one example that you can think of?
That the general public would be, well, sure. We collect in San Diego history and San Diego regional history, and in California history, and in general the history of the West, especially the Southwest. And so as a public university, we have a mission to serve the needs of the interested public in this area. But our primary mission is to serve the needs of our students and our faculty and the curriculum. One thing of interest, I think, to the general public, but also of our faculty, is collections we have here on the history of astronomy. And one shining example of that is the first instance of the imprint of a sun-centered cosmology. Nicholas Copernicus published in 1543, or he had published his Revolution of the Heavenly Bodies, and that is the first appearance in print of a cosmology where the Earth and the planets revolve around the sun, not the sun and the planets revolving around the Earth. And so it's a watershed moment in man's understanding of his place in the cosmos. And this particular volume is really interesting because it's got all kinds of papal marginalia. The papacy went in and would cross out portions of the manuscript, and in the margin in Latin say, well, this is just Copernicus's interpretation, it's speculation, he's not proven anything. That's throughout the manuscript, and it remained on the banned books list of the Catholic Church until the 19th century. So there's things like that we have. We just received a gift of 18th century American newspapers, two titles, and a set of volumes from these two titles that deal with the French Revolution. So you can see the reporting of the French Revolution in the United States, but about 2 months later, because it took 2 months for information to travel by ship. But you can see Henry XVI's last will and testament, his trial, his sentence to death. There's another title about 10 years later where it's during John Adams' presidency, where they're concerned that the French Revolution will be exported to the States. So that's the origin of the Alien and Sedition Acts, and you can see that reported in that newspaper. So we have things that our students and faculty, but the general public, I think would be fascinated with.
Absolutely. I was sitting here like, wow, that's just amazing. And again, we got off the Panzram subject, but what happens is I end up talking to people, and then they talk about the things they do, and I'm like, wow, that's just so much more interesting than what I could even ask you, which, again, you said yourself you weren't a Panzram expert, but I wanted to get, as many voices from the documentary on here as I could, which I did. So I wanted anything else you want to throw out or talk about that you feel is important. I want you to go ahead and go for it.
Yeah, I'm not an authority on Panzram by any means. That's John and Joel and Tom Gitchoff, and of course I can't overemphasize the importance of Henry Lesser. When you read the Panzram, I don't have time to read these collections.
Mm-hmm.
The time I have is to make sure they get preserved and made accessible. But in doing some things with John and just talking with Joel, and over the last couple of years being involved in public presentations about the Panzram autobiography, it's hard to say. Panzram was hanged for the murder of a prison guard. We know that, and we know Panzram was incarcerated for theft, but all the other murders he claims can't be proven. And so I would tell readers that the Panzram manuscript is interesting as far as his reflections on and his assessment of his own violent behavior. He starts asking the question, why am I this way? Now he justifies it by the abuse he received, and in the manuscript he blames his treatment in reform school and prison for his violent actions. And I think he has said many times, I've done as I was taught to do. you taught me how to live my life, and I have lived as you taught me. But for us to focus on